Saint Juan Diego Cuauhtlatoatzin, also known as Juan Diegotzil, a native of Mexico, is the first Roman Catholic indigenous saint from the Americas. He is said to have been granted an apparition of the Virgin Mary on 4 separate occasions in December 1531 at the hill of Tepeyac, then outside but now well within metropolitan Mexico City. The Basilica of Guadalupe, located at the foot of the hill of Tepeyac, claims to possess Juan Diego's mantle, a cloak on which an image of the Virgin is said to have been impressed by a miracle as a pledge of the authenticity of the apparitions. These apparitions and the imparting of the miraculous image are the basis of the cult of Our Lady of Guadalupe, which is ubiquitous in Mexico, prevalent throughout the Spanish-speaking Americas, and increasingly widespread beyond. As a result, the Basilica of Guadalupe is now the world's major center of pilgrimage for Roman Catholics, receiving 22 million visitors in 2010. Juan Diego was beatified in 1990 and canonized in 2002. Biography. According to the sources identified below, Juan Diego was an Indian born in 1474 in Cuautitlan, and at the time of the apparitions he lived there or in Tepeyac. Although not destitute, he was neither rich nor influential. His religious fervor, his artlessness, his respectful but gracious demeanor towards the Virgin Mary and the initially skeptical Bishop Juan de Zumaraga, as well as his devotion to his sick uncle and, subsequently, to the Virgin at her shrine, all of which are central to the tradition, are among his defining characteristics and testify to the sanctity of life, which is the indispensable criterion for canonization. He and his wife Maria Lucia were among the first to be baptized after the arrival of the main group of 12 Franciscan missionaries in Mexico in 1524. His wife died 2 years before the apparitions, although one source claims she died 2 years after them. There is no firm tradition as to the marital relations. It is variously reported that after the baptism he and his wife were inspired by a sermon on chastity to live celibately, alternatively that they lived celibately throughout the marriage, and in the further alternative that both of them lived and died as virgins. Alternatives and may not necessarily conflict with other reports that Juan Diego had a son. Intrinsic to the narrative is Juan Diego's uncle, Juan Bernardino, but beyond him, Maria Lucia, and Juan Diego's putative son. No other family members are mentioned in the tradition. At least 2 18th-century nuns claim to be descended from Juan Diego. After the apparitions, Juan Diego was permitted to live next to the hermitage erected at the foot of the hill of Tepeyac, and he dedicated the rest of his life to serving the Virgin Mary at the shrine erected in accordance with her wishes. The date of death is given as 1548. Main sources. The earliest notices of an apparition of the Virgin Mary at Tepeyac to an Indian are to be found in various annals which are regarded by Dr. Miguel Leon Portia, one of the leading Mexican scholars in this field, as demonstrating that effectively many people were already flocking to the chapel of Tepeyac long before 1556, and that the tradition of Juan Diego and the apparitions of Tenantizan had already spread. Others go only as far as saying that such notices, a few, brief, ambiguous and themselves posterior by many years, if correctly dated to the 16th century. The Codex Escalada, which portrays one of the apparitions and states that Juan Diego died worthily in 1548, must be accounted among the earliest and clearest of such notices. After the annals, a number of publications arose. Sanchez has a few scattered sentences noting Juan Diego's uneventful life at the Hermitage in the 16 years from the apparitions to his death. The Huelamahui Cultica at the start of the Nicanmopua and at the end of the section known as the Nicanmopectana. There is some information concerning Juan Diego's life before and after the apparitions, giving many insights instances of his sanctity of life. Becerra Tanco, Juan Diego's town of origin, place of residence at the date of the apparitions, and the name of his wife are given at pages 1 and 2 of the 6th edition. His heroic virtues are eulogized at pages 40 to 42. Other biographical information about Juan Diego is set out on page 50. On page 49 is the remark that Juan Diego and his wife remained chaste at the least after the baptism, having been impressed by a sermon on chastity said to have been preached by Fray Toribio de Benevent. Slight and fragmented notices appear in the hearsay testimony of 7 of the indigenous witnesses collected with other testimonies in the Informaciones Jurídicas de 1666, Chapter 18 of Francisco de la Florencha's Estrella de El Norte de Mexico contains the first systematic account of Juan Diego's life, with attention given to some divergent strands in the tradition. Guadalupe narrative. The following account is based on that given in the Nican Mopoua, which was first published in Ahuatl in 1649 as part of a compendious work known as the Huelamahui Coltica. No part of that work was available in Spanish until 1895 when, as part of the celebrations for the coronation of the image of the Virgin of Guadalupe in that year, there was published a translation of the Nican Mopoua dating from the 18th century. This translation, however, was made from an incomplete copy of the original, nor was any part of the Huelamahui Coltica republished until 1929, when a facsimile of the original was published by Primo Feliciano Velázquez together with a full translation into Spanish, since when the Nican Mopoua, in its various translations and redactions, has supplanted all other versions as the narrative of preference. The precise dates in December 1531 were not recorded in the Nican Mopoua, but are taken from the chronology first established by Mateo de la Cruz in 1660. Juan Diego, as a devout neophyte, was in the habit of regularly walking from his home to the Franciscan mission station at Tlatelolco for religious instruction and to perform his religious duties. His route passed by the hill at Tepeyac. First apparition. At dawn on Saturday, December 9, 1531, while on his usual journey, he encountered the Virgin Mary, who revealed herself as the ever-Virgin Mother of God and instructed him to request the bishop to erect a chapel in her honor so that she might relieve the distress of all those who call on her in the need. He delivered the request, but was told by the bishop to come back another day after he had had time to reflect upon what Juan Diego had told him. Second apparition. Later the same day, returning to Tepeyac, Juan Diego encountered the Virgin again and announced the failure of his mission, suggesting that because he was a back frame, a tail, a wing, a man of no importance, she would do better to recruit someone of greater standing, but she insisted that it was he whom she wanted for the task. Juan Diego agreed to return to the bishop to repeat his request. This he did on the morning of Sunday, December 10, when he found the bishop more compliant. The bishop, however, asked for a sign to prove that the apparition was truly of heaven. Third apparition. Juan Diego returned immediately to Tepeyac and, encountering the Virgin Mary, reported the bishop's request for a sign. She condescended to provide one on the following day. By Monday, December 11, however, Juan Diego's uncle Juan Bernardino had fallen sick and Juan Diego was obliged to attend to him. In the very early hours of Tuesday, December 12, Juan Bernardino's condition having deteriorated overnight, Juan Diego set out to Tlatelolco to get a priest to hear Juan Bernardino's confession and minister to him on his deathbed. Fourth apparition. In order to avoid being delayed by the Virgin and embarrassed at having failed to meet her on the Monday as agreed, Juan Diego chose another route around the hill. but the Virgin intercepted him and asked where he was going. Juan Diego explained what had happened, and the Virgin gently chided him for not having had recourse to her, in the words which have become the most famous phrase of the Guadalupe event and are inscribed over the main entrance to the Basilica of Guadalupe. She asked, "No estoy yo aquí que soy tu madre." She assured him that Juan Bernardino had now recovered, and she told him to climb the hill and collect flowers growing there. Obeying her, Juan Diego found an abundance of flowers unseasonably in bloom on the rocky outcrop where only cactus and scrub normally grew. Using his open mantle as a sack, he returned to the Virgin. She rearranged the flowers and told him to take them to the bishop. On gaining admission to the bishop in Mexico City later that day, Juan Diego opened his mantle. The flowers poured to the floor, and the bishop saw they had left on the mantle an imprint of the Virgin's image, which he immediately venerated. Fifth apparition. The next day Juan Diego found his uncle fully recovered, as the Virgin had assured him, and Juan Bernardino recounted that he too had seen her at his bedside, that she had instructed him to inform the bishop of this apparition and of his miraculous cure, and that she had told him she desired to be known under the title of Guadalupe. The bishop kept Juan Diego's mantle first in his private chapel and then in the church on public display, where it attracted great attention. On December 26, 1531, a procession formed for taking the miraculous image back to Tepeyac, where it was installed in a small hastily erected chapel. In course of this procession, the first miracle was allegedly performed when an Indian was mortally wounded in the neck by an arrow shot by accident during some stylized martial displays executed in honor of the Virgin. In great distress, the Indians carried him before the Virgin's image and pleaded for his life. Upon the arrow being withdrawn, the victim made a full and immediate recovery. Beatification and canonization. The modern movement for the canonization of Juan Diego can be said to have arisen in earnest in 1974 during celebrations marking the 400th anniversary of the traditional date of his birth, but it was not until January 1984 that the then Archbishop of Mexico, Cardinal Ernesto Corripio Ahumada, named a postulator to supervise and coordinate the inquiry, and initiated the formal process for canonization. The procedure for this first or diocesan stage of the canonization process had recently been reformed and simplified by order of Pope John Paul II. Beatification. The diocesan inquiry was formally concluded in March 1986, and the decree opening the Roman stage of the process was obtained on April 7, 1986. When the decree of validity of the diocesan inquiry was given on January 9, 1987, the candidate became officially venerable. The documentation was published in 1989, in which year all the bishops of Mexico petitioned the Holy See in support of the cause. Thereafter, there was a scrutiny of the position by consultors expert in history and by consultors expert in theology, following which the Congregation for the Causes of Saints formally approved the position, and Pope John Paul II signed the relative decree on April 9, 1990. The process of beatification was completed in a ceremony presided over by Pope John Paul II at the Basilica of Guadalupe on May 6, 1990, when December 9 was declared as the feast day to be held annually in honor of the candidate for sainthood, thereafter known as Blessed Juan Diego Cuauhtlatoatzin, in accordance with the exceptional cases provided for by Urban VIII when regulating the procedures for beatification and canonization. The requirement for an authenticating miracle prior to beatification was dispensed with on the grounds of the antiquity of the cult. Miracles, notwithstanding the fact that the beatification was equivalent The normal requirement is that at least one miracle must be attributable to the intercession of the candidate before the cause for canonization can be brought to completion. The events accepted as fulfilling this requirement occurred between May 3 and 9, 1990 in Querétaro, Mexico, when a 20-year-old drug addict named Juan José Barragán Silva fell 10 meters headfirst from an apartment balcony onto a cement area in an apparent suicide bid. His mother Esperanza, who witnessed the fall, invoked Juan Diego to save her son, who had sustained severe injuries to his spinal column, neck and cranium. Barragán was taken to hospital where he went into coma, from which he suddenly emerged on May 6, 1990. A week later he was sufficiently recovered to be discharged. The reputed miracle was investigated according to the usual procedure of the Congregation for the Causes of Saints. First, the facts of the case were gathered in Mexico and forwarded to Rome for approval as to sufficiency, which was granted in November 1994. Next, the unanimous report of 5 medical consultors was received and approved by the congregation in February 1998. Further, the case was passed to theological consultors who examined the nexus between the fall and the injuries, the mother's faith in an invocation of blessed Juan Diego, and the recovery, inexplicable in medical terms. The unanimous approval was signified in May 2001. Finally, in September 2001, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints voted to approve the miracle, and the relative decree formally acknowledging the events as miraculous was signed by Pope John Paul II on December 20, 2001. The Catholic Church considers an approved miracle to be a divinely granted validation of the results achieved by the human process of inquiry, which constitutes a cause for canonization. Canonization, as not infrequently happens, the process for canonization in this case was subject to delays and obstacles of various kinds. In the instant case, certain interventions were initiated through unorthodox routes in early 1998 by a small group of ecclesiastics in Mexico pressing for a review of the sufficiency of the historical investigation. This review, which not infrequently occurs in cases of acquittal and beatifications, was entrusted by the Congregation for the Causes of Saints to a special historical commission headed by the Mexican ecclesiastical historians Fidel González, Eduardo Chavez Sanchez, and José Guerrero. The results of the review were presented to the Congregation for the Causes of Saints on October 28, 1998, which unanimously approved them. In the following year, the fruit of the Commission's work was published in book form by González, Chavez Sanchez and Guerrero under the title Encuentro de la Virgen de Guadalupe y Juan Diego. This served, however, only to intensify the protests of those who were attempting to delay or prevent the canonization, and the arguments over the quality of the scholarship displayed by the Encuentro were conducted first in private and then in public. The main objection against the Encuentro was that it failed adequately to distinguish between the antiquity of the cult and the antiquity of the tradition of the apparitions. The argument on the other side was that every tradition has an initial oral stage where documentation will be lacking. The authenticity of the Codex Escalada and the dating of the Nican Mopo'ua to the 16th or 17th century have material bearing on the duration of the oral stage. Final approbation of the decree of canonization was signified in a consistory held on February 26, 2002, at which Pope John Paul II announced that the rite of canonization would take place in Mexico at the Basilica of Guadalupe on July 31, 2002, as indeed occurred. Historicity debate. The debate over the historicity of Saint Juan Diego, and by extension of the apparitions and the miraculous image, is largely a discussion of the reliability of the various documentary sources, and the value, if any, to be placed on an oral tradition which, depending on the view taken of the sources, was first written down either a decade or a century after the year when Saint Juan Diego is said to have died. Fundamental objections to the historicity of the Guadalupe event, grounded in the silence of the very sources which, so it is argued, are those most likely to have referred to it, were raised as long ago as 1794 by Juan Bautista Munoz and were expounded in detail by the renowned Mexican historian Joaquin Garcia Icaz Balseta in a confidential report dated 1883 commissioned by the then Archbishop of Mexico and first published in 1896. The silence of the sources is discussed in a separate section below. The most prolific contemporary protagonist in the debate is Stafford Poole, a historian and Vincentian priest in the United States of America, who questioned the integrity and rigor of the historical investigation conducted by the Catholic Church in the interval between Juan Diego's beatification and his canonization. For a brief period in mid-1996, a vigorous debate was ignited in Mexico when it emerged that Guillermo Schulenberg, who at the time was 80 years of age and had been abbot of the Basilica of Guadalupe since 1963, did not believe that Juan Diego was a historical person, of that it is his mantle which is conserved and venerated at the Basilica. The debate, however, was focused not so much on the weight to be accorded to the historical sources which attest to Juan Diego's existence as on the propriety of abbot Schulenberg retaining an official position which, so it was objected, his advanced age, allegedly extravagant lifestyle and heterodox views disqualified him from holding. Abbot Schulenberg's resignation terminated the debate. The scandal, however, re-erupted in January 2002 when the Italian journalist Andrea Tornielli published in the Italian newspaper Il Giornale a confidential letter dated December 4, 2001, which Schulenberg had sent to Cardinal Sodano, the then Secretary of State at the Vatican, reprising reservations over the historicity of Juan Diego. Partly in response to these and other issues, the Congregation for the Causes of Saints reopened the historical phase of the investigation in 1998, and in November of that year declared itself satisfied with the results. Following the canonization in 2002, the Catholic Church considers the question closed.